All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. If you could take your seats, we'll commence proceedings. So welcome, everyone, to the 2025 Australasian Aid Conference. Let's begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting and pay our respects to their elders, past and present. My name's Stephen Howes, and I'm the Director of the Development Policy Centre. And I started this conference along with Anthea from the Asia Foundation. We started back in 2014, and we took a short break during COVID. We shifted from the start of the year to the end of the year, but we've been going from strength to strength, and here we are again in 2025. And one thing that's changed is that I'm no longer the conference organiser. I've handed over to Cameron over there, and his team of some of them downstairs, Aloha, some of them in the room, Estelle. And I've got to say, it's a delight for me just to be able to turn up. So this is my only official duty at the conference, actually. And so that's why I want to take the opportunity before we start. This will be my only chance to thank my colleagues for all their hard work. So in anticipation of a fantastic conference, could you please thank the conference organisers? The other thing I'll say by way of introduction, people always ask us, what's the theme of the conference? Every conference needs a theme, and we always say we don't have a theme. We're believers in bottom-up rather than top-down planning. But as happens, things emerge. And definitely one of the themes from this conference is around the rise of China. The rise of China and its impact on development. And you'll see that throughout the conference, but of course you'll see it today in this session. And then one of the keynotes we have, in fact it's our 2025 Mitchell oration on Friday, is with Eric Olander, Editor-in-Chief of the China Global South Project on China, the Global South and Post-American International Order. So I'm sure we will find that theme, among others, very interesting. And it is great that we can we can start the conference on this very interesting theme and with this very interesting new book written by Professor David Skidmore. So today we call Day Zero, or the pre-conference. So the official launch of the conference is actually tomorrow, but it's great to see so many of you here today. And what we try to do on this first afternoon, or pre-afternoon, is basically look at new research that's come out in the form of books or reports. And we have, after this session, we'll split up into two, and then have afternoon tea, and then split up into another two. So we have 5 launches altogether. And I also invite you to stay back for the Welcome to Country and opening reception at 5 o'clock. It's a beautiful day, so please enjoy that. This is our afternoon of launches, and we're beginning now with our keynote book launch with Professor David Skidmore. So David he's online. He's joining us from the US. It's evening where David is, so thank you very much, David, for staying up late and for agreeing to give us this address and to take questions on your new book. And we're calling this the keynote book launch of David's book, China, the West, and the Global Development Finance Regime, Competitive Convergence. And I won't say more about the book, except that it is new. That's why we're launching it. It was just published this year. Cameron has already reviewed it, so you can go to his review on the Dev Policy blog. And of course, after today's talk, I'm sure you want to get a copy of the book for yourself. But just to briefly introduce David, he received his PhD from Stanford and then taught at Hamilton College and the University of Notre Dame before arriving at Drake University, where he is now, and where he's been since 1989. And he's now the Professor of Political Science. He's worked in China since, well, on and off, but first of all from 1996. And he's written several books. This is not his first book. And one book that caught my attention was The Unilateralist Temptation in American Foreign Policy. So it's great to have someone who's an expert on both US and China to address us today. So David's going to speak for about half an hour, and then we'll have an interactive session. So please do participate with your short comments and questions, and David will be able to hear you. We also have people online, so welcome as well if you're joining us online, and I hope you can also take part in the conversation. But for now, please join with me in welcoming David Skidmore. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'd like to thank Stephen, Cameron, Finn, Estelle, and the other organizers for giving me this opportunity to share a few thoughts drawn from my recent book. It's a pleasure to join a group of 8 professionals whose work is directly shaping development outcomes around the world. At the same time, it's a bit daunting to speak to an audience with such deep expertise, so I look forward to learning from you during the Q&A period. As Stephen mentioned, my first experience with China was teaching at the Hopkins Nanjing Center in 1996. And I've spent a year in Hong Kong and as a Fulbright scholar in 2010, and I've been back and forth many times. So China's been an ongoing interest. I'm a political scientist, an international relations scholar with an interest in international political economy, so I'm not a development specialist. You'll kind of see the political science angle as I talk about my book. It's sort of broad and sweeping in a lot of ways. And this particular project arose from my interest in the debate over how China's rise as an illiberal great power impacts the liberal international order. That's a big topic. So I looked around for more manageable ways to get at a bite-sized chunk of the problem. So China's growing role as a provider of development finance, I think, offers a particularly useful angle from which to address that broader question. A decade ago, many predicted a fractured global order, a liberal rules-based development regime led by the West versus a statist, mercantilist, and illiberal alternative led by China. Yet the evidence from the development finance regime shows the opposite. Great power competition has generated emulation rather than bifurcation, convergence rather than divergence, with both sides borrowing ideas, practices, and institutional models from one another. This is the essence of what I call competitive convergence. The story begins with China's global financing surge, which began in 2013 with 2 landmark moves, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and of course, the Belt and Road Initiative. China's new financial initiatives responded to an acute infrastructure shortages across the global south. In Africa, for instance, half the population lacks electricity, a third face water shortages, and road, rail, and aviation infrastructure remains limited. From the supply side, China's lending push was a response to domestic imperatives, the need to recycle large current account surpluses to find new outlets for excess construction capacity, and to better ensure a steady flow of raw materials, along with emerging geopolitical priorities on China's part. Early Western reactions tagged these initiatives as threats to the existing development finance framework. The common framing was rogue aid. Analysts warned the AIB would diminish multilateral development bank standards, and that the BRI represented a statist challenge to OECD DAC norms, potentially splitting the development world, the development world into rival blocks. But predictions of a bifurcated order were exaggerated. To see why, we have to first understand the system China was supposedly challenging. The Western-led development finance regime evolved within the broader post-World War II liberal international order, moving through three phases. The embedded liberalism from the 1940s through the 70s involved state-led development, industrial policy, and large public investments. Neoliberalism of the 80s through the 2000s featured structural adjustment, conditionality, privatization, and market orthodoxy. What I call post-neoliberal pluralism, 2008 to the present, features a renewed space for state involvement and flexible development strategies. What's crucial is that China's own economic rise unfolded inside this system. China worked closely with the World Bank from 1980 onward. Bank staff helped guide early reform strategies. China borrowed heavily from the bank, at one point becoming its largest borrower. China also drew inspiration from Japanese infrastructure-led development, a precursor to what Beijing later exported through the Belt and Road Initiative. China was therefore not an external challenger arriving with a fully formed alternative. It was a participant shaped by the existing regime, seeking both greater voice and room to innovate. That background matters because it helps explain the nature of Chinese divergence and later convergence with established Western norms. From the early 2000s through roughly 2017, China's bilateral lending, especially the Belt and Road, did in fact diverge from DAC norms and practices quite substantially. BRI lending prioritized large-scale infrastructure, particularly transport, energy, and industrial parks. This diverged from the DAC's emphasis on poverty reduction strategies, health, education, and social protection, environmental safeguards, governance institutions, and anti-corruption. DAC donors favored soft aid and social sectors while China doubled down on hard infrastructure growth. The BRI model grew out of practices within China itself following the 2008 financial crisis, which brought together a nexus of policy banks, local governments, and large construction companies to support the largest infrastructure push in the history of the world. The BRI sought to export this model. The financial terms of Chinese loans typically featured non-concessional or semi-concessional terms, high collateralization requirements, shorter maturities, and commercial rate interest from state-owned banks. This contrasted with DAC preferences for concessionality and debt sustainability frameworks. China emphasized no political conditionality, no governance reforms as prerequisites for lending, and non-interference in internal affairs. By contrast, DAC norms incorporated governance, human rights, environmental standards, and fiduciary safeguards. BRI contracts were often undisclosed or confidential, excluded from public debt statistics, negotiated bilaterally and quietly. This was a sharp departure from the DAC's commitments to open data, disclosure, and harmonization. The BRI frequently relied upon Chinese SOEs as turnkey contractors, tied procurement, rapid delivery with limited local consultation. DAC norms were moving steadily toward local ownership, capacity building, and competitive procurement. In short, this early BRI represented a major structural challenge to the DAC-centered regime. Yet over the last 6 to 7 years, China has adjusted the BRI in ways that narrow the gap with DAC practices. There are several drivers that help explain this shift. Debt distress in borrower countries, reputational costs from stalled or failed projects, competitive pressures from MDBs and G7 countries, diplomatic blowback in Europe and parts of Asia, developing country demands for higher standards, China's own financial limits after its domestic economic slowed down, and of course, institutional learning on China's part. The result has been a partial but significant convergence. The evidence for this includes growing attention to risk management and debt sustainability, stronger ESG standards, increasing focus on green energy development, engagement with multilateral institutions and forums, including limited but significant cooperation with the G20 Common Framework, less financing through policy banks and more through commercial banks, third-party cooperation agreements, syndication loans, and Chinese private firms. And finally, the launch of the Global Development Initiative, with its greater emphasis on soft aid and the Sustainable Development Goals. Clearly, BRI still remains quite distinct from DAC norms, but the gap has narrowed. While bilateral BRI lending initially diverged sharply from DAC norms, but moved gradually toward partial convergence, China's new multilateral development banks, the AIIB and the New Development Bank, leaned toward convergence from the start. The AIIB, for instance, adopted standard MDB governance practices, hired staff with experience working at legacy MDBs, implemented rigorous project evaluation, mirrored environmental and social safeguards, and co-financed extensively with the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank. Rather than disrupt the MDB regime, these institutions validated it and expanded it. Where AIIB sought to distinguish itself, a focus on infrastructure, less red tape, faster loan processing, older MDBs responded by competitively emulating those innovations. Rapid conversion arose from China's desire to be seen as a provider of global public goods and a legitimate institutional leader. Other factors included the stable, long-standing, and highly institutionalized nature of the MDB regime, which is open to new entrants and draws upon deep expert and professional networks. These features provided a strong set of incentives for China's socialization into the existing order. Indeed, even as it promoted new institutions such as the AIIB and the New Development Bank, China remained an active stakeholder and participant in older MDBs, such as the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank. What about the Western response? While the United States criticized both the BRI and the AIIB, most Western states took a more nuanced path. Europe joined the AIIB. Many countries initially explored BRI cooperation, but later grew more cautious. But most importantly, Western countries responded to China not by rejecting its focus on infrastructure, but by adopting that focus for themselves. Examples included, there were a series of initiatives, the G20's billions to trillions agenda, the Blue Dot Network, Build Back Better World, Global Gateway, the European Union, Japan's Partnership for Quality Infrastructure, the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, and the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation. Despite criticisms of the BRI, the West effectively acknowledged that China had identified a real global need, and they moved aggressively to compete within that space. This entailed a more commercial orientation to development finance, public-private partnerships, and a shift in emphasis from poverty alleviation to economic growth. The result of these dynamics is not a fractured world of parallel blocks. Instead, we've seen China's practices have moved closer to DAC norms, especially regarding debt sustainability and safeguards. The West has moved closer to China's strategic emphasis on infrastructure and state-supported development tools. and multilateral institutions remain broadly aligned, with China participating rather than undermining them. In the book, I described this outcome as a hybridized post-neoliberal development finance system, more pluralistic, more contested, but still recognizably part of the broader liberal international order. Rather than two rival orders, we have one evolving ecosystem shaped by both China and the West. I think early analyses failed to appreciate that despite its illiberal domestic political order, China has a deep stake in core aspects of the present international system, even as it seeks to alter some aspects of that order. China's orientation toward its international environment differs fundamentally, for instance, from those of Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, or the Soviet Union, who were clearly revisionist. China has an interest in the survival of an open global economy and the strengthening of those multilateral institutions that underwrite global order and public goods, even as it seeks to strengthen its own influence within that order. Since I completed work on the book, there have been dramatic developments in the world of development finance. The Trump administration has radically cut U.S. ODA, official development assistance, and disbanded the U.S. Agency for International Development. A number of other aid donors have made more modest but still substantial cuts to ODA. On the other hand, Congress is poised to more than quadruple the lending capacity of the Development Finance Corporation. And some of the aid money that was diverted or postponed has been repurposed in support of U.S. geopolitical competition with China, especially in the pursuit of rare earth minerals. It once seemed plausible that a more pluralistic global aid regime might work to the advantage of the Global South, as competition among older and newer donors allowed recipient countries to shop around for the best bargains. Now, however, we face a world where only those countries able to offer donors strategic or commercial advantages attract funding, while those with dire needs of poverty get left behind. These developments over the last 10 months or so, I think, do support the book's thesis of competitive convergence. Yet, the book may have underestimated the threats to the liberal character of the aid regime arising from within the West itself. Indeed, America's open abandonment of DAC norms may place it further outside of the liberal order than present-day Chinese practice. So with that, I'll be happy to take any questions and hear your comments.
All right, well, thank you very much, David. That was very thought-provoking. I hope you can see me. I'm not
Yes.
sure if you can see the audience, but we've got a large lecture theatre and it's quite full. So we have a lot of people here, which is great, listening to you, and I'm hoping there'll be lots of questions. So depending on how many there are, we'll just take them one at a time, or we might bundle them together. But we've got a couple of people with roving mics. So if who'd like to start off with the first question? We've got one right at the back. So Maho, if you could head up, and if you could just introduce yourself with your question, and if others can also put up their hands, we can sort of pre-position so that we, in the interest of time. Thank you.
Hello. Good morning, everyone. Actually, I'm sorry, good afternoon. I'm still at my time zone. My name is Svetlana Zens, Article 19, and I'm covering Asia-Pacific region, specifically on civil society and tech sector engagements. So, yeah, thank you so much for such interesting introduction of your book. Of course, we studied that together with other CSOs in the region, which is also important because since the PRC involvement and influence of the region is quite high. There are good ways and the bad ways as well, but the most concerning thing is that is that some of the repressive regimes in the region are like to employ the bad way. And knowing that, for instance, like several years ago when Western donors were giving aid with the condition of developing democracy, developing human rights and compliance with human rights, that also affects the private sector. Now with PRC influence and unconditional aid, so-called, this influence goes into the violation of human rights, diminishing of freedom of expression, absolutely forgetting about privacy. So in your view, Professor, how do you think we should survive, especially when international actors, like some institutions, like UN, for instance, are trying to down their voices on human rights in the sector, hoping to get some funds which were unfortunately taken by the new administration of the US and substituting it with other donors? So I hope my question was clear. Sorry, it's quite a long introduction. Sorry, thank you.
No, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you for your question. Well, we know that China lends to both democracies and authoritarian governments, and borrowers that have strong democracies, don't necessarily suffer because of borrowing from China. But we do know that when China lends to authoritarian governments, that that helps those governments to double down on their authoritarian practices and human rights disputes. So that it's undercut some of the incentives that other Western aid donors had provided for governments to at least give some protection to citizens and to civil society. China, of course, doesn't really have a civil society in the same way that the West. The government has an enormous sway across the society, and so China's not, when it works abroad, it's not used to dealing with civil society organizations or the media or opposition political parties, and so it works with governments. Increasingly, China's been sending very sophisticated surveillance systems to some countries that, again, provide the ability to crack down on dissent. So yeah, it's a tough environment, I think, in authoritarian countries for civil society groups that are trying to stay safe and to do work. I wish I had solutions for you. I don't really, to be honest.
Okay, thank you. I'll just invite the people right at the back. Please come in and come across. There are seats, more seats available. Yeah, there's a question in the middle. Others with questions?
Hi, I'm Tufail Yousafzai. I'm an economist in British High Commission, FCDO Islamabad, and Crawford alumni as well, so I'm coming here after 10 years. Good to see you, Steve.
Good to see you.
My question is on the fundamental sort of change in sort of the realization that the pathway to reduction in poverty is not to social sector development, but rather it's economic growth. So is there a realization without a hypothesis testing that this is the pathway for development and reducing poverty, that development finance should be targeted towards economic growth rather than directly tackling poverty? So it's not a political science perspective, but from development perspective, I'm asking this question.
Yeah, I think the neoliberal model was basically that the private sector should lead the way to growth, and so you leave the private sector and markets to create the conditions for growth, and then you, in the meantime, deal with those who are not being served by the market, but through poverty alleviation programs. But China never bought into that idea. China's idea was rapid growth would lift all boats, even if it lifted some faster than others. And there's certainly something to be said for China's own experience. The problem is that, and I think growth is a key objective. It is itself an anti-poverty tool. The problem is that the model that China used internally to achieve such rapid growth cannot easily be exported abroad. And in fact, I would argue that the model that China is exporting through the BRI, or was, as I said, it's adjusted to BRI somewhat, but the model was not really the same one that they used in the 80s and the 90s and early 2000s to achieve such rapid growth. That model relied upon external savings, not borrowing from abroad. It was infrastructure development followed rather than led the way to rapid growth. It was only after rapid growth had been going on for some decades before China's biggest infrastructure push came. So growth made the infrastructure push possible rather than the reverse. So I think that, the argument that one should emphasize growth has some logic to it, but the question is how? And it seems to me that it really needs to be tailored to each particular country's circumstances.
Okay. Yeah, Maho, just down a bit. Oh, thank you.
Hi, my name is Geordie Fung. Thanks for the presentation. And I work at the Development Intelligence Lab. A question from sort of the perspective of national narcissism. For a middle power like Australia that is trying to balance some of these different interests, interest in the sort of liberal order, in human rights, in the norms that are being impacted by USAID cuts and the US administration, but also some interest in sort of the more strategic elements of infrastructure investment. What sort of recommendations might you have for Australia and other middle powers on how they engage with different MDBs, and whether we should focus on, whether you would like to see middle powers focus on a sort of broad approach to engagement with lots of different institutions or more targeted approaches? Thanks.
So it's a great question. The so-called middle powers, I think, right now are the best hope for salvaging the liberal international order as such, setting aside the question of the aid regime. And it seems to me that what's needed is for those countries that are committed to certainly reformed, but keeping the best elements of the liberal order, need to work together and form a kind of a bloc to stand up for certain values. And at a time when the United States certainly is not doing that, in fact, is undermining those values very fundamentally. How to do that, I'm not sure, but I will say that unfortunately, it's not only the US that's been cutting aid, it's also European countries. I'm not sure about Australia, but and sometimes in Europe's case, it's kind of understandable because they face the challenge of increasing their defense budgets at a time of slow growth. So I can kind of understand it, but the reality right now is that there have been some studies in showing the effects of just the US aid cuts, much less those of other countries, are going to have on the poor and the hungry and those who are suffering from disease. It's going to be quite substantial, already has been quite substantial. And so, as I said, growth is important, but we can't just abandon people whose very lives are at risk.
Okay, thank you. Look, I might just ask the next question and then we'll come to the front. David, that was, you brought back a lot of memories. I think maybe we're about the same age. But I used to work in the World Bank, And this is back in the 1990s. And I can remember like working on China was like the best job because you had the most projects and the best projects.
Yeah.
And then I came to AAC, which no longer exists, like USAID, but then it did. And, you know, I remember we actually had a group of officials from the Chinese aid, I think incipient sort of aid program, come to AAC for training. Like, how do you do an aid program? And I also remember, you know, we used to have a couple of what we called trilateral cooperation programs, where Australia and China, we funded a program together on malaria in Papua New Guinea. And there was another one, Australia and China and Cook Islands, on water supply. So, and you think about where we are now, is it convergence? I think what you're saying is there was a lot of divergence, and maybe since then there's been some convergence. Like now the West is in, maybe ideologically. I think that's a very good point. But just to draw you out on the future, you know, your final remarks, where do you see it going in the future? Is it going to be convergence or divergence? Because I know Australia is now telling countries, you know, in the security space, if you want to work with us, you can't work with China. Mm-hmm. And you can imagine that broadening out. I mean, it won't be easy because countries won't want to turn their back on either country, but you can imagine it becoming more of a choice for countries as to who they're going to partner with. So do you think this rather optimistic story of convergence is going to hold, or is it going to be overtaken by sort of more security imperatives and we're just sort of heading for more of a Cold War? You know, you've got to choose one camp or the other.
Well, there was another term ahead of the convergence. It was competitive convergence. And so, you know, emulating one another's tactics, trying to move into turf the other side hasn't, you know, in the past had a comparative advantage in. But certainly, you know, there's the broader geopolitical struggle, especially as it begins to focus on the very fundamentals of the economic system. There's the trade order is collapsing around us. You know, the WTO is basically irrelevant at this point. The norms of this trade order are totally overthrown. The competition over resources and supply chains is going to place pressure on governments governments who don't have resources are going to be kind of neglected, and those who have resources will become objects of competition. You know, if it's possible that they can take advantage of that by, you know, trying to play off donors or investors against one another, but at the same time, you know, if you look at a country like Argentina, where the United States is now pressing Argentina to cut its ties with China in order to get bailouts from the U.S., get investments in rare earth metals and things like that. So you're right, countries are going to be pressured to take sides.
Great, and I take the point on competitive convergence. That's a great term. Yeah, we've got another question here. Thank you.
Hi, Professor Skidmore. Thank you for your presentation. I'm Yuxuan Su from National Zhengzhi University from Taiwan.
Oh. Okay, just give us 1 minute.
Too sensitive?
Lady Gaga. And now for something completely different.
Sorry, just keep your hand up.
That's good, they can see you. Great. Hi, David,
Hi.
we lost you, or you lost us, we're back. And here's the next question.
Okay, thank you for your presentation. And I have a question about your opinion on China's aid on sustainable development. So we know on the one hand, China has been exporting their outdated machineries and so on, and also for the infrastructures that can create more pollutions. But on the other hand, China is also very strong on some sustainable technology innovation, like solar energy, wind energy, and so on. So what do you think about the impact on the recipient countries? Do they have the opportunity to be producing greener and have more sustainable technology, or will China continue to monopolize the supply of those technologies and so on? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I was able to see the audience, and I'm a little even more nervous now because I see how many people are there. So, you know, in some ways, even though China is the biggest greenhouse gas emitter in the world, it's doing a great service to humanity by driving down the costs of solar and wind energy, and now it appears EVs as well, and batteries, and across the board, renewables. No other country is doing it on that scale. Of course, it's to China's economic and even geopolitical advantage, but they're making the investments and it's paying off for them, but it's also paying off for others who have the opportunity to make the energy transition from fossil fuels more quickly, or even to, in some places, poor countries, to actually skip over you know, coal plants and go straight to solar farms. But and I think it's a good thing. I think eventually these countries that import renewable and green technologies from China are going to want to produce some of it in their own country, and we'll begin pressing China to start producing, not only selling the technology in their country, but start producing it in their country as well. Maybe initially through, you know, joint ventures and that sort of thing. Already we're seeing in the rich countries that kind of pushback and limits on, for instance, the export of EVs to the United States, and some restrictions even in Europe. So I think countries welcome aspects of, you know, being able to import renewable energy technologies, but they also want the jobs and the investment and the growth and innovation that come with being part of that, and not just consumers.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. I'm Nilesh from University of the South Pacific in Suva, Fiji. And Fiji and few Pacific Island countries were part of the story that you just described, and particularly related to Belt and Road Initiative. And one of the things I didn't hear in your conversation is the role of public enterprises. Like, I've been to China a few times at the invitation of the Chinese government to look at the BRI initiative from the government's perspective, but there's a huge gap in terms of the government narrative and what was happening on the ground through the public enterprises. And in the Pacific, the concept of BRI has basically died down now, not because of pushback, but mainly pullback from China. So, and I really like the idea of competitive convergence. So if it's about competitive convergence, where do you see BRI going, especially in Pacific Island countries? And the Pacific Islands play an important role for China in geopolitics. So where do you see the future of BRI in the Pacific? Thank you.
Yeah, so a few years ago, China did begin pulling back from the massive amount of BRI loans that it was making in the late teens. This was partly to do with the pandemic, but it was also to do with the fact that their estimation was that many of the borrowers had reached their borrowing capacity, that they could not sustainably borrow much more, not only from China, but from other sources as well. And so there was a talk about, you know, Xi Jinping said it would be small and beautiful, higher quality projects, but smaller and not, $10 billion projects. However, if you look at the most recent data, 23 through the current year, China's BRI spending has accelerated again and has reached new highs, actually. So we're seeing a lot of money flowing out, but it's not flowing in the same ways. Before, most of it came through the two big policy banks, and now it's going through commercial banks, going through direct foreign investment, syndication loans with partnering with private bondholders and a variety of different pathways that so BRI is more varied now than it was in the past, and a little bit less. Well, it was never really top down. It was always a bit of a mess, but more diversified, I'll put it that way. I think I'm not an expert at all on the the Pacific region, the Oceania, but I know that there are some some of our guests there in Australia will know a lot more about the competition that's going on over some of the allegiance of these islands and the kind of packages being offered by China. And it's really curious to see whether some of the money that was withdrawn when the USAID funds were pulled back, whether some of that will be restored as countries are being wooed by China.
Thank you. Ian.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. My name is Ian Anderson. I'm an independent consultant. I thought your presentation was very good. You've certainly convinced me about the convergence and the competitive convergence. There's one thing that I was sort of quite intrigued about as I go around PNG and the Pacific is that there's a general impression, that one of the things that differentiates China from others is the quality and the effectiveness and the value for money of their infrastructure. Because there's quite a lot of buildings, very prominent buildings in both Papua New Guinea, Fiji and elsewhere, which simply cannot be opened because they didn't meet the basic sort of building standards or the electricity standards, and they've been basically vacant for years. Now, if there's a failure from a Western country in terms of governance, it's quite hard to sort of spot it, but a building that can't be opened, very visible. And this tends to be now a bit of a reputation and sort of a joking point by the people that I talk to in the Pacific. So I just wonder what your comment about the quality, value for money and the effectiveness of infrastructure of China. Thank you.
So you're saying that the reputation for China's infrastructure is not good?
That's exactly what I'm saying, but at least in PNG and the Pacific. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I think the selling point for Chinese infrastructure is speed and cost. And and scale. China can do projects that at a scale in places that most Western countries, whether public or private sector, would not even consider. So I think those are the issues. But I think that especially in the early BRI, that there were some reputational damage because some of the projects, I was in Uganda and the dam had cracks and the highway was the road was peeling off and they had to come in and fix things. But I think that for many, especially in poor countries, a lot of these projects, the concern is from the leadership standpoint is the political benefit of being able to say that you built a dam or an airport or something big and impressive. And if it has some problems that have to be fixed later on, then that's less important than being able to point to a big project and and China is able to provide those.
Okay, yeah, we've got time for 2 more questions.
Thank you, Professor Skidmore. So my name is Ujjwal Krishna. I work for the Australian Council for International Development, ACFID. I wanted to sort of come back to competitive convergence and think about it from the point of view, and want to hear from you from the point of view of how it impacts sort of strategic culture, strategic thinking, and how sort of development falls within that in China relative to the West and US and Australia in particular. I just sort of wanted to ask you a little bit about how these might differ, or what might be some common threads, because it is competitive convergence in a sense, but what we also see, and as you talked about with China, there is a certain sense of continuity and consistency in functioning within the multilateral order, even if there are temporary sort of divergences from it. But it seems to be a trend of more consistency in terms of engagement with the multilateral order, whereas you have evolved fast in the West from that. So do you think there are some differences in how strategic thinking in both contexts differs in terms of how there can be more consistency in one, whereas there is more sort of contestation and more serious changes of direction in the other? Thanks.
Yes, and of course the case in point is the United States, and we're at a point in our history where we're deeply divided, and there's no agreement on many different things, including America's proper role in the world and the nature of the international order and our part in it. I wrote, as Stephen mentioned, I wrote a book called The Unilateralist Temptation in American Foreign Policy. The currents that Trump is writing and provoking are not new. Isolationism is not really the right term. It's more unilateralism and a deep distrust of international institutions, which are seen by some as threats to American sovereignty and independence. So we lurch between a president who talks about America's back and the multilateral order is fundamental to America's strategy in the world, and to one that seems to hark back to a kind of 19th century imperialism and threatens to invade other countries for their resources. So, that's when I started the book, I guess, it was at a time when one could kind of assume that the United States was going to play some, central role in the liberal international order. And now it's really much more of a disruptive presence, to be honest, than China ever has been. And it's hard to know how you get it back from this point, because so much has been, the institutions have been damaged. AID doesn't exist anymore. I was just reading about the Foreign Service. The Foreign Service is being radically cut. The National Security Council was radically cut. The entire institutional structure that underpinned American leadership in the world for 7 or 8 decades is being demolished. And it's not going to be as easy as a new president just, brings it back into being overnight. So it's very hard to see where we're going right now. And probably my book is an inadequate guide to the future, to be honest.
Well, look, I know I said we'd have 2 more questions, but I think it'll be hard to beat that exchange. I think you're very humble, David. I think it'd be very hard to give an adequate guide to the future at the current time, but you've certainly illuminated the past, and that should help us going forward. One of the points of this conference is so we step back from our everyday job, which is probably somewhere micro, working on a specific project, development or research and step back, think about where the world's going. And I think with you, we've already had two for the price of one, because you've told us a lot about China, but also you've told us a lot about how the US is responding and lurching. So I think it's been a very interesting and insightful hour. I think we will bring it to a close, because we're starting the next session without a break. So if you're staying in this room, oh no, sorry, you're not going to stay in this room. Everyone's got to get to the next room in 2 minutes. So we definitely have to end. You can either go to the Barton Theatre for the book launch on gender in Fiji, or Western on conflict with Deakin University. But before we go, please join with me in thank you very much, David, for that fascinating talk. And do stay for drinks at 5 o'clock. And tomorrow morning we're starting, Cameron, at? 8:40. So a delayed start tomorrow morning, 8:40. Thank you. Thanks, David.